You're not invited, Valeria. Don't make this more pathetic than it already is. Julian's voice crackled over the speakerphone, oozing a smugness that made my skin crawl. It's Christmas, Julian. Mom's silver is on that table because I polished it for a decade. The turkey is there because I paid the mortgage this month. I snapped, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the steering wheel of my truck. Then, my father's gravelly voice cut in the background, cold and dismissive. Let it go, Julian. Your sister has always been difficult. We need a peaceful night for a change. She'll just bring up the debts again and ruin the mood for everyone. Tell her we'll send her the leftovers via Uber tomorrow. Click. The line went dead. I sat there in the cab of my Ford F-150, parked in the middle of a deserted gas station. The neon sign above flickered open in a sickly red hue against the black, suffocating Montana sky. Leftovers. That was my life in a nutshell. Picking up the scraps of affection they threw my way, while I single-handedly kept their failing world spinning. For 31 years, I had been the reliable one, the forensic accountant who could find a needle in a haystack of offshore shell companies. I had tracked millions for federal agencies, but I had been blind to the daylight robbery happening in my own living room. My father, Arthur, saw me as a personal ATM. My brother, Julian, saw me as a safety net for his spiraling gambling debts. But they didn't know. They didn't know that 3 hours ago, while they were pouring expensive scotch that I had purchased, I had signed the final digital documents. They didn't know that the $820,000 they thought was sitting in our shared family trust had been legally diverted. I hadn't stolen it. I had reclaimed it. Every cent was a drop of my sweat, a piece of my soul they had tried to leech away for years. I slammed the truck into gear, the tires spitting gravel as I headed north. I wasn't going to their dinner. I was going to my fortress. The drive to the Highwood Mountains was a blur of white lines and blinding snow. By the time I reached the gates of the ranch, the wind was howling like a wounded animal. This place, a sprawling 800-acre sanctuary of cedar, stone, and ancient pines, was now mine. I had bought it out from under Julian's nose just weeks after his financing fell through. He had bragged about turning it into a luxury hunting lodge. Now it was going to be his graveyard, metaphorically speaking. I stepped out of the truck, the -10-degree air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't flinch. I felt a strange, soaring sense of ownership. Valeria's Ridge, I whispered into the gale. I spent the next 3 days in a fever dream of productivity. I didn't hire a crew. I didn't want witnesses. I climbed ladders in the freezing wind, my fingers numb as I drilled high-definition 4K cameras into the eaves. I replaced every single lock with commercial-grade deadbolts that required biometric scans. I was building a cage, and I knew exactly who the rats were. On the third afternoon, the silence of the mountains was finally shattered. I was sitting in my darkened kitchen, the only light coming from the glow of my laptop as I monitored a shell corporation's ledger. Suddenly, the ground vibrated. A heavy diesel engine was laboring up my private road. I didn't panic. I reached for my iPad and opened the security app. A black Cadillac Escalade, a rental, no doubt, fishtailed in the deep powder of my driveway. Arthur stepped out first, wearing his $3,000 shearling coat, looking like a king visiting his subjects. Then came Julian, kicking the snow off his designer boots with a proprietary smirk. They weren't alone. A third man, a nervous-looking fellow in a cheap suit clutching a clipboard, shuffled out after them. A realtor. They weren't here to apologize for Christmas. They were here to sell my home. I watched on the monitor as Arthur pulled out a heavy set of keys, the ones to our old warehouse, and tried the lock on my front door. He jiggled it. He cursed. He shoved his shoulder against the oak, but the deadbolt didn't budge an inch. "Get the pry bar from the trunk, Julian," Arthur barked, his voice carrying clearly through the external mics I'd installed. "I don't know what kind of game the brat is playing, changing the locks on my property, but I'm not standing out here in the cold." The door didn't just open. It groaned and shrieked as the wood gave way under Julian's brute force. I stood in the shadows of the long hallway, my back pressed against the cold stone wall, watching them spill into my foyer. They didn't enter like guests. They entered like conquerors. Arthur walked in first, tossing his snow-dusted coat onto my handmade oak bench without a second thought. He began pacing the length of the room, his eyes scanning the vaulted ceilings and the massive stone fireplace, not with admiration, but with a calculating greed. "Not bad," Julian grunted, tossing the red steel pry bar onto the Persian rug I'd bought with my last bonus. It left a greasy streak of rust on the wool. "The kid actually has decent taste when she isn't being a total drag. We can probably list this for $1.1 million if we stage it right." "1.2, Arthur corrected, his voice echoing with a chilling authority. "The timber market is up, and this acreage is prime. We'll have the papers signed by Friday. I've already contacted the lawyer to handle the trustee override. Valeria is unstable. We'll just claim she's had a breakdown, and we're liquidating the asset for her own protection." The realtor, a man named Mr. Henderson, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Sterling, are we sure about the ownership? My office pulled a preliminary title and—" "I told you, Henderson," Arthur snapped, turning on the man with a ferocity that made him flinch. "I am the head of the Sterling family. My daughter used my funds to secure this. In the eyes of God and my bank account, this is mine. Now, start taking the measurements. I want the sold sign up before the snow melts." I felt the rage bubbling in my throat, hot and metallic like blood. It wasn't just the house. It was the way they talked about me in the third person, as if I were a ghost or a piece of faulty equipment. For 31 years, I had been the ghost in their machine, fixing their tax returns, hiding Julian's gambling debts from the authorities, and nodding politely while Arthur told everyone at the country club how he'd guided my career. I stepped out of the shadows. "The sold sign is going to look a little strange on property you don't own, Dad," I said, my voice steady and cold. The three of them jumped. Julian let out a pathetic yelp, nearly tripping over the pry bar. Arthur froze, his face turning a mottled purple as he slowly turned to face me. "Valeria," he breathed, quickly recovering his mask of paternal disappointment. "You gave us quite a scare. Breaking in? We had to use force because you weren't answering your phone. We were worried." "Worried about the commission or the Vegas markers?" I asked, walking slowly toward them, my iPad still clutched in my hand. I looked at Julian. "You look thin, brother. Those men with the baseball bats still looking for that $200,000 you negotiated your way out of 3 years ago?" Julian's eyes went wide. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm a forensic accountant, Julian," I said, leaning against the kitchen island. "I don't just find money. I find the lies people tell to hide it. I know you didn't negotiate. I know Dad paid them off using the money I sent for Mom's medical trust. You two didn't just steal from me. You stole from her memory." "Enough!" Arthur roared, slamming his fist onto the marble countertop. "I am the trustee of this family's wealth. You are a child playing at being an adult. You will hand over the keys and the deed, or I will have you removed from this house in handcuffs for theft of family funds." "Family funds?" I laughed, and the sound was jagged and sharp. "The trust account is empty, Arthur. I closed it on Christmas Eve. That money didn't belong to the Sterling family. It belonged to the person who actually worked for it, me." You arrogant little... Julian started, taking a step toward me, his fists clenched. Don't, I warned, raising the iPad. The cameras saw everything. The forced entry, the pry bar, the realtor witnessing your plan to commit fraud. I've already uploaded the footage to a secure server. If you take one more step, I hit send to the county sheriff. You wouldn't, Arthur hissed, though the uncertainty was finally creeping into his eyes. You're a Sterling. You wouldn't disgrace the name. The name is already disgraced, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. And as of this morning, I'm not a Sterling anymore. I legally changed my name back to Mom's maiden name. I'm a Vance now, and a Vance doesn't owe you a damn thing. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades of resentment. Arthur looked at the shattered doorframe, then back at me, realizing for the first time that his difficult daughter was no longer under his thumb. Get out, I said, pointing to the gaping hole they had made. Before I decide that trespassing isn't a strong enough word for what you've done today. The silence that followed their departure was not the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a landslide. I stood by the frosted window, watching the red tail lights of the Escalade disappear into the swirling white void of the Montana night. My heart was a drum, beating out a rhythmic cadence of adrenaline and lingering fury. Beneath the anger, however, was something sturdier, a cold, calculating resolve. I knew Arthur Sterling. He didn't see people. He saw assets to be managed or liabilities to be liquidated. To him, I had just transitioned from a high-yield asset to a hostile competitor. He wouldn't go back to the city to lick his wounds. He would go to the nearest motel, open his laptop, and start looking for a way to burn my world to the ground before sunrise. I walked over to the shattered door. The wood was splintered, the heavy brass lock hanging uselessly by a single stripped screw. I didn't feel like a victim looking at the damage. I felt like a general surveying a breach in the perimeter. My phone buzzed on the granite counter. A text from Beatrice, my lawyer, and the only person who knew the full depth of the Sterling family's rot. They just tried to freeze your primary account, Val. Arthur filed an emergency injunction claiming diminished mental capacity and financial instability. He's playing the crazy daughter card. He wants a court-appointed guardianship. I leaned against the counter, a grim, sharp smile tugging at my lips. Predictable, Arthur. So painfully predictable, I muttered to the empty room. I grabbed my laptop and opened my private encrypted drive. If Arthur wanted to talk about capacity and financial stability, we could talk about his. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best, following the ghost of a paper trail. As a forensic accountant, I knew that men like my father never leave a clean path. They leave a scent of greed that lingers on every digital signature they touch. I found it at 2:15 a.m., a series of clandestine transfers from the family's old construction firm, the one that went bankrupt 5 years ago, leaving dozens of subcontractors penniless to a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Blue Horizon Holdings. Arthur had told the creditors there was nothing left. He had told me, with fake tears in his eyes, that he'd lost his entire soul trying to save the business. He hadn't lost it. He'd hidden it. Exactly $2.4 million had been moved in increments of $9,900 to avoid federal reporting triggers. It was textbook money laundering, and he had used Julian's name on half the documents as a consultant to spread the dirt. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While I was working 80-hour weeks to pay off Julian's gambling debts and keep the lights on in Arthur's penthouse, they were sitting on a mountain of stolen cash. They hadn't needed my help. They had just enjoyed the sport of watching me struggle to provide it. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unlisted number. I answered, my voice ablaze. You're up late, Arthur. Plotting more fraud? You have 24 hours to vacate that ranch, Valeria. His voice was a low, dangerous hiss. I've already spoken to a judge. By tomorrow afternoon, I'll have a psychiatric hold placed on you. You'll be in a facility for evaluation, and I'll be the guardian of your interests. All of them. A psychiatric hold? That's your move? I asked, laughing softly. It's a bit old-fashioned, don't you think? Very Victorian. It's effective, he snapped. You've stolen family funds, changed your name, and retreated to the woods like a lunatic. No judge will rule in your favor. Then it's a good thing I'm not looking for a judge, Dad. I'm looking for a federal auditor, I said, my finger hovering over the send key on an email to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Does the name Blue Horizon Holdings ring a bell? Or should I ask Julian? He's the primary beneficiary of the 2021 distributions. $2.4 million is a lot of prison time. The silence on the other end was absolute. For the first time in my life, I had silenced the king. What do you want? He finally whispered, the arrogance replaced by a jagged edge of panic. I want what's mine, I said. I want a signed release of all claims to this property. I want a confession of the embezzlement held in escrow by Beatrice. And I want you to forget I exist. If I see your car on my road again, the feds get the drive. I'm not a Sterling anymore, Arthur. I'm a Vance. And a Vance always collects her debts. I hung up before he could respond. The storm outside was breaking, and for the first time in 31 years, I could finally breathe. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I didn't sleep. I sat in the center of my darkened living room, the glow of 6 security monitors illuminating my face. Outside, the Montana wind had died down, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. I knew Arthur wouldn't go quietly. Men who build empires on lies don't just hand over the keys. They try to burn the palace down with you inside. At 3 a.m. on the second night, my perimeter sensors chimed. A single vehicle was approaching without its headlights. I didn't reach for the phone. I reached for the shotgun leaning against the kitchen island. I watched the screen as the black SUV stopped at my gate. A figure stepped out, not Arthur, but Julian. He looked disheveled, his expensive designer jacket stained with what looked like grease, his movements frantic. He didn't try to break the door this time. He stood on the porch and hammered his fist against the wood. Valeria, open the door. We need to talk. It's not about the house anymore. I stepped toward the door, keeping the chain engaged. Go home, Julian. I told Dad the terms. There's nothing left to say. He's lost it, Val. Julian's voice cracked, bordering on a sob. When you brought up Blue Horizon, he went into a rage. He's at the local sheriff's office right now. He's not filing for a psychiatric hold anymore. He's reporting the truck you're driving as stolen, and he's claiming you embezzled the $820,000 from his personal accounts through identity theft. He's framing you for a felony to discredit your testimony before the IRS can look at the drive. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. Arthur was playing the scorched earth card. If I were arrested for a felony, my credibility as a forensic accountant would be incinerated. No federal agency would take a whistleblower seriously if she were under indictment for the very crime she was reporting. And what are you doing here, Julian? Playing the concerned brother? I hissed through the crack in the door. I'm trying to save my own skin, he yelled, his face pressed against the gap. He's going to pin the Cayman accounts on me if things go south. He told me tonight that I'm the fall guy because my signature is on the distributions. Val, If you have proof that he forced me to sign those, please, I'll testify. I'll give you everything. Just don't let him send me to prison. I stared at him. My brother, the golden child, the man who had mocked me for years while I cleaned up his messes. He looked pathetic. He was a cornered rat looking for a new hole to hide in. But he was also a witness. You want a deal? I asked, my voice as hard as stone. You go to Beatrice's office in the morning. You sign a sworn affidavit detailing every offshore transfer Arthur ordered. You hand over your login credentials for the Blue Horizon portal. You do that, and I'll leave your name out of the initial IRS filing. He'll kill me, Julian whispered, looking back at the dark road. He's already killing you, Julian. He's just doing it slowly, I replied. Now get off my porch. I have a sheriff to meet. I closed the door and locked it. 10 minutes later, blue and red lights began to dance against the snow-covered trees. Sheriff Miller's cruiser pulled into the driveway, followed by a second car. Arthur had actually done it. He was standing in the front seat of the second vehicle, a smug, triumphant smile on his face as the deputies stepped out. I didn't wait for them to knock. I walked out onto the porch, my hands empty and visible, my iPad tucked under my arm. Sheriff Miller, I called out, my voice carrying in the crisp air. I assume my father told you I stole his truck and his money? That's the report, Miss Sterling. Or Vance, I hear, the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable. He knew me. I'd helped him audit the county's books last year. I have the bill of sale for the truck in my name, signed 6 months ago. And as for the money, I turned the iPad screen toward him, showing the legal transfer of the trust funds, authorized by a court order Arthur had forgotten I'd obtained. I think you'll find the only person committing a crime tonight is the man behind you filing a false police report. I looked past the sheriff, straight into Arthur's eyes. The smugness vanished, replaced by a look of pure animalistic terror. He realized then that I hadn't just moved the money. I had legally outmaneuvered him months before the first snowflake fell. Arrest her! Arthur screamed, jumping out of the car. She's lying! She's a thief! Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Miller growled, before I decide to look into that false report charge myself. I watched them drive away, but I knew the final blow was yet to come. The trap was set, the evidence was documented, and by morning, the Sterling Empire would be nothing but ash and bone. The morning sun rose over the Highwood Mountains with a brilliant, blinding clarity that only follows a brutal storm. I stood on my porch, a steaming cup of black coffee in my hands, watching the light catch the frost on the pine needles. For the first time in my adult life, the air didn't feel heavy with the weight of someone else's expectations. It felt like oxygen. My phone chimed, a final notification from Beatrice. It's done, Val. Julian spent 4 hours in the deposition chair. He spilled everything. Arthur was picked up by federal agents at his hotel an hour ago. They're seizing the Cayman assets as we speak. I let out a long, shuddering breath. The war was over. An hour later, a familiar car pulled up the driveway. It wasn't the black Escalade of my nightmares, but Beatrice's sensible sedan. She stepped out, clutching a thick black binder, the same one that contained the legal shield she had helped me build. Beside her was Sheriff Miller. He tried to run, Valeria, the sheriff said, leaning against his cruiser. Had a suitcase full of cash and a one-way ticket to Panama. But between your digital trail and your brother's confession, he didn't even make it to the airport gate. And Julian? I asked. He's a state witness now, Beatrice replied, joining me on the porch. He'll avoid the heavy prison time, but he's forfeited every dime he ever took from the trust. He's starting over with nothing. He asked if he could call you. I told him not to hold his breath. I looked out over the 800 acres of pristine Montana wilderness. This land was no longer just a vault for my money. It was a testament to my survival. I had spent 31 years as a secondary character in the Arthur Sterling show, a ghost haunted by the greed of men who shared my blood, but not my soul. Val, Beatrice said softly, you realize the trust is legally yours now? After the federal fines and the restitution to the subcontractors, there's still nearly $1.8 million left. You're free. Truly free. I nodded, but the money didn't feel like the prize. The prize was the silence. The prize was the fact that when I looked at the broken door frame, I didn't see a wound. I saw an exit. I walked back inside and sat at the scarred wooden table. I opened my laptop one last time, but not to track a thief or audit a lie. I opened a blank document. I typed my new name at the top, Valeria Vance. I blocked the last of the numbers, the aunts who wanted bail money, the friends of the family who wanted a statement, and finally, the encrypted line to my father's lawyer. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt the cold, clean indifference of a ledger that had finally been balanced. They thought they had exiled me to the cold. They didn't realize that I was born for the winter. They thought they could sell my home, but they forgot that home isn't a piece of real estate. It's the place where you no longer have to hide. I closed the laptop and looked at the fireplace where the remnants of Julian's lodge sign had burned to ash days ago. The house was warm. The locks were secure. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one wearing the boots. Family is supposed to be your backup, not your backbreaker. Don't let blood be an excuse for people to use you. Stand your ground, set your boundaries, and don't be afraid to walk away from toxic people. You owe it to yourself to be free. Thanks for listening. I hope this story gives you the strength to stand your ground. If you enjoyed it, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.